Laura and Cecilia will cover that in a moment. Behavioral science is trying to thinking about interventions that really take into account how people will eventually react to specific incentives. And we think that this is one of the very important elements to take into consideration when addressing many of the challenges that you can find in cities, from waste management, water consumption, mobility issues, etc. Because it's really, we know that digital solutions can provide some specific methods or improvements. So you can measure how much water or electricity you are consuming, but at the end, there's a behavioral component behind, and that's what we will talk about today. So with no further delay, I would like to present you Cecilia Shang and 𝘼𝙗𝙤𝙪𝙩. They are both senior associates at Ideas42. They will be presenting a little bit on the methodology to adopt behavioral insights in projects. Afterwards, we will be having like a 10-minute questions and answer session. So we invite you to put your questions, comments, and everything that you would like to communicate in the chat. And at the end, Peter will be moderating a little bit a debate and questions and answers with the speakers. And finally, we will do a closure of the webinar and of this Smart City Training Series 2021 for the first semester. Laura, Cecilia, all yours. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Cecilia is going to share her screen and she's going to drive the slides, and we are going to switch places a little bit in the meantime while she's figuring out sharing the slides. I just wanted to say hi to everyone and to thank you so much for being here today. We are so honored to close this series of trainings. As Elba mentioned, I am Laura Cojocaru, my colleague is Cecilia Shang, and today we are going to talk a little bit about behavioral science. We are going to give you a very brief introduction, and in particular, we are going to start talking a little bit about the behavioral science method. So today's agenda, as you can see in the next slide, is that we are just going to give you a very brief introduction to who we are. We are going to talk about the actual approach that Ideas42 takes to behavioral change. And then we are going to walk it through a brief and I think representative case study that is going to be meaningful for the SMART series work. And at the end, we will have time reserved for discussions and questions if you have them. So who we are. Ideas42 is a leading applied behavioral science organization. We have been active in this field since 2008, and our goal is to use insights from the fields of behavioral science, economics, psychology, design, and apply them in the real world in a way that promotes social good. Next. As you can see from here, from this map, we work in many, many countries. I think currently there are actually about 45 countries in which we had projects, and we work in areas as diverse as education, economic mobility, governance, energy, the environment, and financial health. Next. So what's the reason for behavioral science and what's at the basis of behavioral science? Well, a lot of our work actually focuses on understanding how people make decisions. Why do you think that this is so important? Well, because billions of people, like all of us, make what is like trillions of decisions at work, at home, and everywhere in between. So there are so many decisions being made all the time. And some of these decisions are actually optimal, great, but some are not, as you will see on the slide. So here's one example. These guys that are going to the fitness, they are going to the gym, and they are actually taking the escalator to get there. These kids who are definitely ignoring this danger sign. This thing that probably you do every day, I definitely did it this morning, where, you know, you set up the alarm to wake up bright and early, and then you keep snoozing it. So one of the things that we would like to show you, and you may have seen this before if you're part of our previous sessions, we want to start by talking about the standard model of behavior. To understand what behavioral science actually brings to the table, is helpful to understand what the standard method of thinking about decision-making and behavior is. And this is something that both economists and policymakers, and probably all of us citizens, use in order to think about human behavior. So normally we like to think that when making a decision, people start by comparing the costs and the benefits of a certain action. And then if the benefits are greater than the costs, then they decide to take that action. And if they aren't, they decide not to take it. And from that, the action will follow immediately. And then you can see the outcome. And that also infers that once you see the outcome, whether the outcome is the one that corresponds to a certain action, that is because people deem that the benefits are greater than the costs. However, that is really not how the real world usually works. It is much more complicated, in fact. So sometimes we make decisions, sometimes we don't make decisions, and sometimes we simply don't know. And then from decision to action, there isn't usually a typically simple way that follows directly. People's actions are usually influenced by a lot of factors in the context. So in order to decide if we actually want to act on our decision, we might be looking at what other people are doing, how difficult that action is, how long it will take. Maybe we can actually do it, but tomorrow, not today, and so on. Next, please. So here are some takeaways that compare these two models. The standard decision-making model that I was showing earlier assumes that we usually make the right choices and then we act on them. However, that may not always work. Context matters, and context influences our behavior a lot. This is why we actually need a behavioral approach. This behavioral approach to decision-making is much more helpful in making sense of how people actually behave rather than how they should be behaving. So this is the role of behavioral science. Behavioral science studies human behavior, and it specifically studies how humans truly really make decisions and how they take or don't take actions in the real world. What's also great is that we don't only aim to understand how people behave and why they behave in a certain way, but we usually also have tools to influence that behavior. The tools that are usually offered by behavioral science have the advantage of being typically low or no cost, and they can improve the outcomes of certain actions and policies, usually with very, very little cost, and that helps us make the most of our limited resources. So moving on to what does it actually mean in practice, we are now going to show you our typical steps when we think about changing a very specific behavior. I'm going to hand it over to Cecilia, who is going to walk you through Ideas42's methodology for behavioral change.
Thank you, Lara. So now that you have a sense of what behavioral science is and how it's useful, you might wonder how to apply it to your own work. At Ideas42, we separate our process into 5 stages with the acronym of DDDTS, if you want to help remember it. And that stands for, first, defining behavior-based problems, diagnosing those problems to understand them, and then designing and implementing solutions, testing those solutions to see if they have their intended impact, and of course, if the solutions are effective and successful, scaling our learnings and having impact at a broader scale. And today will be a very rapid walk through all 5 stages, so we won't be able to get into the specifics of each, but you can feel free to leave questions in the chat, which we'll answer at the end, and the slides will also be shared after the presentation. The first step of the process is to define the problem. Albert Einstein once said, if I were given 1 hour to save the planet, I would spend 59 minutes defining the problem and 1 minute resolving it. And while you may not need to go that far, problem definition is a crucial step that we might otherwise take for granted. And there are 3 guidelines to keep in mind when defining a behavioral problem. The first is to focus on a specific behavior rather than a general issue. It may be easy to start by naming a broader issue we see, for example, that too much energy is being used. But this could refer to any number of behaviors and does not help us figure out what exactly we're trying to change. In the second problem statement, we are focusing on people running their home appliances at night. And framing it in this way allows us to name a desired behavior to turn appliances off that we can then work on and approach. The second guideline is to state the problem without embedded assumptions. It's fairly common to assume that people just don't understand the situation or they don't care enough to change their behavior. And in some cases that may be true, but oftentimes there are other things that are more important and that are more important to changing behavior. And we want to leave ourselves open to these other possibilities so we can find the most efficient and effective solution. And finally, related to the first point, we want to make sure to define the problem at a level that we can tackle. So this one's kind of easier to see in an example. So let's use this example problem statement and go through our 3 criteria. So people have unhealthy diets because they don't have access to nutrition information. Maybe take 2 seconds and run through the criteria in your head and kind of see if you think it satisfies these. So for the first criteria, is it focused on a specific behavior? If you thought no, you're correct. An unhealthy diet is the result of eating behavior, but it encompasses a lot of different individual choices and actions. So we could do better here. Does it state it without assumptions? Also no. This problem statement assumes that more information, more nutrition information would be the solution. And finally, is it defined at the right level? 0 for 3, also no, this problem statement is too broad for us to approach. So here's an example of what a potential revised problem statement could look like. Remote workers eat unhealthy meals at home. Desired behavior, eat healthy meals at home. The second step in the process is diagnosis. And in diagnosis, we do a deep dive to look at features of the context in which the behavior is occurring. And then we use what we know about the human mind from behavioral science and psychology, and we draw insights about how these two interact to influence behavior. And for the behavioral approach, this will be a theme throughout, but context is crucial. So the contextual features we look for can range from small details to broader environmental factors. And while some really important factors of the context might be visible, such as how options are presented or what the physical environment looks like, other very important contextual features such as timing, social context, or scarcity may not be physical things you can see or just point to. So it's really important to make sure we have a good understanding of the context. Just as one example, theological students going between 2 buildings encountered a shabbily dressed person slumped by the side of the road who was clearly in need of help. In this study, when individuals were told they were late and had to rush to the other building in a hurry, they were much more likely to pass by without stopping to help. And interestingly, this was true even for those who were about to give a short talk, telling others about the importance of being a good Samaritan and helping strangers. So this study is just an example of how even when we have strong intentions, elements of our environment can get in the way. It's not the person, it's kind of the situational factors and context. The next step in our process is design. And in design, we go from the specific problems and diagnosis insights to ideas for solutions. The word design can make people think of art and visual products, but in fact, design can take many different forms. They can be physical, such as a kitchen safe to keep temptations away, or a smart pill cap that reminds you to take your medication, or they can be simple communications, such as mailers, online videos, or even something as seemingly mundane as a reminder to pay a parking ticket. And beyond things you can hold, you can also think about designing and redesigning processes or physical spaces. And it depends all on what channels you have available. And while there are many possibilities, there are still some guidelines to follow in design. First, we want to make sure the design addresses the specific diagnosis barriers and insights that we found about the context. And this means that small details are really important because the effectiveness of a design can hinge on those very details. And in a similar vein, designs that might seem small, such as formatting changes to a letter, can have an outsized impact on behavior. And finally, because we know that context matters, we can't just take something that worked in one instance and assume it'll work somewhere else if we just drop it. So our design process always includes user testing and working with people who are kind of experts of the local context to ensure the proposed intervention design actually reflects the needs and desires of the people who will be impacted. And finally, once we have a design, we move to the final stages of testing and scaling. Testing is pretty much all about answering the one question: did our intervention work or not? And being able to answer this question is powerful. Without an evaluation or without a test, there is no way to know if the designs truly changed behavior and had a positive impact. So to answer this question, we need to measure the effect of the design solution. There are many ways to do this, and each way has its own implication in terms of rigor and accuracy, and also the complexity and resources required. And we could do a whole session and spend a lot of time talking about different ways of testing, but we don't have time to get into that today. But I do want to say that the gold standard of social science research are randomized control trials. And these allow us to say this design and not other factors caused this percentage change in behavior. But we know that these randomized control trials are not always possible given time and resource and capacity constraints. So that was a whirlwind, but hopefully gives you a taste of what our process looks like. And I just also want to note that while this image looks linear, in reality, the process is iterative, and we go back and forth between stages to make sure we're refining and incorporating our learnings throughout. And I'm going to pass it back to Laura to walk you through a case study with a worked out example of all 5 stages, which should hopefully help make it a little bit more concrete.
Thank you, Cecilia. So very quickly, I'm going to walk you through an example of applying behavioral science to the real world. It's a case study that is based on a project done by some of our colleagues at Ideas42 a few years back in the Western Cape in South Africa. So the case study is based on reducing corporate energy usage in South Africa. In Cape Town, there has been rapid urbanization, and there is a lot of energy insecurity, which leads to periodic brownouts or load shedding. So basically it means that the electricity needs to be interrupted for certain parts of the city for a few hours periodically in order to conserve some of the energy. Residential and commercial sectors account for a large percentage of the electricity used in Cape Town. It's about 83%, or at least that's what it was back then. And the state government office is actually a major use of electricity. So in this study, we actually focused on reducing energy consumption among government employees because we believe that there was a lot of room for improvement there, and also because, like I mentioned earlier, they were accounting for a relatively large percentage of the energy use in the city. So our problem statement was, how can we actually help government employees to reduce energy consumption? We identified in the process of diagnosis, we identified a number of barriers to cutting corporate energy use, among them limited feedback. So employees were not able to monitor or benchmark their own energy consumption. There was also diffusion of responsibility among employees. There was not one person or group that was in charge with conserving energy in the building. And there was also a lot of uncertainty. In other words, employees, they didn't exactly know how could they cut individual energy use. So these were the barriers that came up in diagnostic, and the solution was a relatively simple one and definitely inexpensive because all the employees had access to email. Our colleagues decided that a very easy channel to attempt was sending them emails. However, these were not just regular emails. These were behaviorally designed emails. They employed several well-known and recognized as impactful behavioral design elements, such as social competition. They were celebrating, I'm not sure how.
Abilities and capacities that are necessary for the job that maybe stronger people don't have. That's as far as we got, which if you think about it, it's not
okay.
Just a little bit. But,
I'm not sure where the noise
terribly
is coming from. Anyway, back to this. So the emails were celebrating the floors that were able to reduce their energy consumption the most. And they are also providing a benchmark for other floors. And also they were trying to spur a little bit of friendly competition between the floors in the building. They also, in order to address the diffusion of responsibility, each week an energy champion was put in charge with conserving energy for their own floor. And in follow-up emails, they would also receive very concrete tips and tricks how to actually conserve energy. So did this work? Like Cecilia mentioned, it's never certain that something will work. So in this case, we actually employed an RCT, which compared what happened pre-intervention versus post-intervention in two groups, one that received these behaviorally informed emails and one group that didn't. What happened to their energy consumption? What we mentioned was, as you can see, what we noticed was that, as you can see in the beginning, before the intervention, the two groups were quite similar. However, after the intervention, the treatment group, the one that received the behaviorally informed emails, reduced their energy consumption by 14%. This is not a trivial amount of energy consumption, especially because it did not involve anything coercive. It didn't receive a change in price. It didn't receive punishing, or it didn't involve punishing or anything like that. It was a simple behaviorally informed email. So yeah, this amounted to a 24% reduction in annual costs for the building. Let's move on, please, Cecilia. So after this very, very quick introduction to behavioral science and to Ideas42's method to applying behavioral science, I wanted to let you know that this is just scratching the surface. And if you are interested in the topic and you would want to start employing behavioral science in your own organization, there are many ways in which you could do this. You could, of course, start by building your own capacity in behavioral science or that of your team. There are many free online tools and resources that are also short or longer. One day, for example, courses that Ideas42 and other organizations are offering, but you can also employ or embed even teams into your organization to have more assistance for actually developing, testing, implementing and testing a project. And we also want to give a shout out to our own City Nudge Accelerator, which is a specific model that Ideas42 has developed in order to help cities and local governments employ behavioral science without actually taking any financial risks. We are trying to make more cities see the benefits that they could get from employing behavioral science, and we are very happy to follow up with any of you if you are interested, and we are also going to share some of the materials in a follow-up email. Phew, that was it. We are very happy to answer any of your questions now or later via email. Thank you so much, everyone.
Great. So I just want to know if anybody can see my screen here. So Laura, I think you just have to stop sharing from here. Great. Okay. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're in the world. We'll be doing a very brief Q&A, selecting 3 questions just to wrap up. We have about 15 minutes left from the session here. And just to reiterate what Laura was saying, everybody in this session today will receive a follow-up email. And for those who didn't register, this is all recorded, so not to worry about that. So since we have a lot of participants here from UNDP country offices, perhaps a good general question to start would be, Laura, Cecilia, it's up to you if you want to take this. How do we know when adopting a behavioral approach is suitable? The floor is yours to Cecilia or Laura to answer that question.
That's an excellent question, and it's probably one of the first things that one should do before thinking about behavioral science. We have to recognize that as powerful as behavioral science is, it cannot address all potential problems in this world. There are many structural issues that cannot be addressed through behavioral science. For example, if the problem is that there is no road that gets into a city, there is absolutely no sense in trying to convince people that they should use public transportation if there is no public transportation. So it's always helpful to use a critical eye and think about, is this actually effective? There are also other methods, including economic approaches, that can be especially effective in certain situations, potentially even more effective than behavioral solutions. So there is not one straight answer. There is not one algorithm that tells you, in this case, definitely behavioral science would work, and in this case, it definitely wouldn't. However, it's always helpful to understand, is this about human behavior? Is this something that people should be doing and they aren't doing, but they could? Do they have the infrastructure to do this? And then even in those cases where you decide that it is about human behavior, it is always helpful to think, what other methods do you have available? Usually, one of the main advantages of behavioral science is that it's cheap. It's easy to implement. It's much easier to implement a behavioral solution than an economic or political solution or legislative solution. It does not always work as effectively. However, there are cases where the problem is so clearly behavioral that if you are going to try to employ a legislative or some other type of more coercive, for example, type of solution, not only will you get a lot of pushback from the population and it will be more expensive, but it will actually not be effective, because that is not at the root of the problem. And I know I'm not necessarily answering in a simple way that is going to give you a yardstick for deciding. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that you have to be very careful and make decisions on a case-by-case basis and not look at everything through one particular lens only.
And I'll just add to that. I completely agree with everything Lara said. One kind of heuristic we sometimes use when looking for behavioral problems, or things that when you know that maybe behavioral science will be especially useful, is when we see what we call an intention action gap. So like Lara said, if it seems like they can do it and they actually want to do it, but for some reason they aren't following through, that is kind of a hint or an indicator that maybe there's something that behavioral science can do to kind of leverage what we know about the context and the human mind to help them achieve that goal.
Okay. So I guess there's no set indicators in how we could put it in a framework or in a model for the behavior approach, but there's always ways to identify, which probably brings back to my second question here, because as we are living in the age of COVID-19, there's been a plethora of digital solutions. How can we combine the behavior approach with digital solutions, and is gamification a behavioral approach? I'm happy if Cecilia takes this one if you want to, or Laura, you look eager to answer this. And then I'll pass it on to Elba, just consider that time, that's all. Yep.
I know Cecilia has a lot of good thoughts on this, so go ahead, Cecilia.
Yeah, we can both share our thoughts. I would say definitely digital tools are a great channel for applying behavioral approaches. And in fact, one of the projects that Laura and myself are working on is working with 311 kind of citizen request platforms to help officials kind of respond to those requests in a more timely and accurate manner. I think gamification also is one of the designs we're working with. There's a lot of kind of literature around gamification. I will say, I think gamification is not kind of a catch-all magic solution. I think oftentimes you like kind of incentives and other things have to also be considered. But for sure, digital tools I think are really interesting and kind of you can think are low cost and oftentimes easy to scale. And then of course, there are also considerations around the accessibility and whether everyone can kind of reap the benefits of those digital tools, which I know the UN has done a lot of thinking on as well.
And just one other thing that I wanted to add to this was that digital tools are a great channel if available. They are usually very amenable for easy A/B testing and other types of quick changes that allow you to design the most effective solution. Gamification, I would think of it as a behavioral approach. However, one of the things that I hope we can make clear here is that at least at Ideas42, our approach is by not starting with a solution. We don't necessarily have one solution in mind. This is why we go through all those steps that Cecilia was describing earlier, where we actually try to understand what is the behavioral problem. And then based on that, we are trying to tailor the solutions, usually starting with one preferred solution. For example, I really love gamification, may not lead you to the best design possible, because maybe the issue is not something that can be addressed through gamification. It can be addressed potentially through some different behavioral solutions or designs, but I think it's usually a dangerous path to start with your preferred solution and try to kind of retrofit it to whatever the problem might be. Which doesn't say that gamification is not a very valuable solution when it is the right one.
There's an unintentional bias, I guess, when you go with just, a gamification approach first head on. I see so many questions that everybody is filling in the chat, which is really great and would be wonderful. We've got that during the presentation, but not to worry, we will try our best to answer that with the time given. If not, we will do it in the follow-up email. However, there was one participant that I just want to get this question answered by Sriti. Does monetary incentives count as behavior approach? For instance, if a government announces that a village gets completely vaccinated, we'll get a fixed amount of money. Is that a behavior approach? So I'm happy if Cecilia or Laura answers this one. And for the rest, we might be able to squeeze maybe a couple. Yeah.
That is a wonderful question, and it's so appropriate to the situation today. So the short answer would be that financial incentives are not a typical behavioral solution. They are an economic type of solution. However, you can always you could make the case that depending on the size of that incentive and the way it is offered and the timing of it, you can always apply a behavioral angle to it. So there are cases in which the actual amount of money is not sufficient to actually sway the people's decisions. So you are probably, if you are against vaccination, if you don't want to get vaccinated, the amount of money that you receive should not be enough to sway you. You are probably concerned for your life, or you have some other serious concerns, and it's unlikely that the amount of money that the government can give you would be sufficient to account for that risk that you are not willing to take before. However, there are cases in which the amount of the incentive, the financial incentive, can be given in such a way that it actually plays a more behavioral role than a monetary role. For example, in the case that the participant was describing here, what I could think of is the fact that you are giving the incentive to the entire village. So there is an element there of social pressure. So if the entire village is getting it, then people are going to convince one another, you should go and get the vaccine, because then we are all going to win this prize, even though that prize is not going to go to any individual. There is this amount of social pressure, for example, that would convince people to perhaps not change their mind if they are completely against it, but if they are, on the cusp, or they are actually convinced to get it, but there is a case of intention-action gap, to actually go and get their vaccine. So I would say that the case described here could be qualified as a behavioral intervention, although I do not know all the details.
I will also my personal opinion is that there's a behavioral side to almost everything. So to a certain degree, some of it is semantics and whether you want to call it an economic kind of intervention or behavioral intervention. But even for financial incentives or financial kind of levers, for example, we did do a project kind of looking at the Chicago bag tax, but there are behavioral studies that show how if you call something a tax versus a rebate, that can have an impact on how people perceive that. Because of course, having to pay money feels more strong than a potential gain I might get back in the future. So different aspects like that. And like Laura said, for example, do you give everyone this financial money, or maybe you make it a lottery, or you make it a competition? So the use of money in and of itself, I don't think disqualifies it from being behavioral. And there are tons of different ways you can think about doing it that have behavioral lens.
There's just one last question, which I think can tie it up from here, Cecilia. As you were mentioning about the intention gaps, are there any useful frameworks or tools to identify intention action gaps?
I think I can't point to a particular kind of framework, but for us, I think it's part of our problem definition and diagnosis, in which and I didn't mention, but in problem definition, we try to look at the data and see kind of where the drop-offs are in a particular kind of series of actions and decisions, and kind of use our knowledge about behavioral science to try to understand why there might be drop-offs, and to make sure we actually talk to and understand the people for whom we're kind of designing for and trying to understand. Yeah, I think, Laura, if you have anything else to add there.
No, there is not a formal tool, that although you can always perhaps use some survey or something of that sort that lets you know if people actually express the intention to act in a certain way. So for example, if you ask people about health behaviors or eating behaviors, or savings or things like that, you would often see that in a survey, or when you talk to people, they will tell you, yes, I do want to lose weight, and yes, I do want to go to the gym and eat healthy and save more money, which clearly tells you that that's not something against their will. It's something that they would be willing to do, which kind of makes you think that, there is something that happens in between making that decision and taking the action. One of the things that we usually use as a yardstick in deciding the projects that we want to work on is the fact that we don't typically try to do something against people's will. So unless they actually have already formed an intention to act in a certain way and they believe themselves that it's for their own good, it's unlikely that you will succeed in changing their mind. It's not impossible, and there are situations, of course, where that might actually be necessary, but that is typically much more difficult than actually helping people from who have already formed a positive intention to act in a certain way, to just go over that gap and actually follow through on their decisions. It's much more difficult to actually convince people that being healthy is important, than actually taking a person who thinks being healthy is important and helping them achieve that goal.
Wow. So I have been taking a very strong mental note about this, and though no one saw me writing down on a notepad, I hope everybody was. Thank you so much, Laura, Cecilia. We're just going to pass it on to Elba now to close. But before that, I'm just about to send a feedback link here for everyone to just fill out. It's voluntary, but it'll help us to plan for season 3 and the future from here. So Elba, over to you. Thank you very much, Cecilia and Laura, and also the participants for joining.
Thank you, Peter. And I echo Peter's thank you to Laura and Cecilia for participating in this second session on behavior insights. I think that it has been super useful, especially I will highlight what it is behavioral insights and applying this framework and what is not. So the difference between with economic incentives and what are not, and also how important it is to well define the problem, just to know very concretely where we want to act, why we want to act on that, and then to define the good solution that will lead us also to understand if it's a behavioral approach that it is needed or not. So thank you very much for all these insights. I think it has been a really short, as usual in this training series, but short but really intense and super useful session. And yeah, thank you very much also to all the participants, the ones that have followed us throughout all the sessions, on several of them. The ones that it's the first time that they are following, thank you for being with us today. Thank you, Laura and Cecilia, for your contributions. It has been really interesting, and hope to see you in the upcoming third session of the third season of the training series. And please please provide feedback on the feedback form that Peter has put in the chat. That will really help us for the future events. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.